So today we're on chapter 4, and chapter 4 is called Human Population. I mentioned to you that when Meredith Leonard and I, many years ago, had a stack of textbooks that all the publishers had sent us, McGraw-Hill, Pearson, Cengage. Actually, it was quite a pile. And we went through them to see which ones we thought were good. Now, we had a lot of criteria. Among those is that the book fit inside a 16-week semester, which doesn't always work. For example, a lot of publishers will publish a hardbound version of a book that has upwards of 20 chapters. Those books are designed for quarters, because quarters typically run for 10 weeks. So you might take a course, for example, I think UCLA is still using quarters, that has the designation AB, like English 1A/B, right? And that's because you take it for 2 quarters. In other words, you take it for 20 weeks. So those books are great for quarter systems and terrible for semesters. It means if we use them, we have to actually knock chapters off that we don't cover at all. So our second criteria was it should have 16 or 18 chapters, no more. And it should be cheaper than a hardbound. And it should have really good graphics and a really well done book. And then I had another criteria, which is if chapter 1 is human population, I don't want the book. And you'll see today why I feel so strongly about that. There is really, in a sense, the Achilles heel. I'll say it's that. Many of my colleagues would not agree with me. But I think the Achilles heel of environmentalism, if we can say such a thing, at least back when I was hatching from my egg, meaning when I was first taking environmental studies and environmental sciences seriously as a major in college, it was an issue. The issue was the influence of Thomas Malthus, a classical economist, and neo-Malthusians, those were the contemporaries in the 1970s, who really laid the, if you want to call it the blame, for biodiversity loss, for pollution, for all the ills of the world on the rather alarming and incredible growth of human population, which has happened in a relatively short period of time. Back then, this issue was really a dividing line, a very important dividing line in environmental science, particularly environmental studies. Now, unfortunately, in the world of environmental science, you often have people whose specializations or background are in such fields as geology, or in other words, they didn't do social science. And as a result, when it comes to engaging with ideas in what I would say social science and economics that are particularly unscientific, they don't see that. They miss the fact that it's not good science. In fact, it's bad theory, bad science. So they adopt it because it's a very, dare I say, lazy answer. If human population growth is the answer to all of our problems, as I mentioned to you earlier this semester, then we should just close half the departments in universities because they don't think so. Sociology doesn't say that social problems come from too many people. Economics doesn't say that. Political science doesn't say that. All across the board, social sciences don't say that the causes and origins of human problems is that there's too many people. There is a famous economist by the name of Thomas Malthus who really went further than that. So we're going to talk about Thomas Malthus today and the neo-Malthusians, and I should get started immediately. Where's my finder? I think it worked. Okay, so chapter 4, human population. The very first picture you see in this chapter on page 77 is a scene in Thailand. I don't know if this is Bangkok, but it's very Thai-looking architecture, as you can see. Why begin with Thailand when our With God and La Posada Pearson book actually begins with, actually begins with China. And they're very interesting parallel stories. In the 1970s, as China's revolution was fundamentally changing the country from the inside out and the top down, a lot of changes came very quickly. And among those is that the revolution had a double-edged sword, excuse me, meaning that under Mao's plan for collectivizing agriculture, it set off a famine in China because 1/3 of the communes that were set up under Mao failed, which meant that people starved. On the 1/3 of the communes did very well, and 1/3 of them stayed about the same. So the process of collectivizing agriculture, which has always been fraught with difficulty in centrally planned economies, which is what communist governments typically are. Central planning takes the place of markets. So the state allocates resources and the state establishes goals and quotas, and you have basically a governmental structure that takes the place of capitalism in market economies. So China confronted the fact that their population started to grow very, very quickly. And they realized that their farm sector, their collectivized agriculture, would not keep up with population growth, that they couldn't. And that because they believed then in self-reliance or even self-sufficiency, China was not about to begin importing food to feed its people. So that really put them in a corner. And as a result, they realized, of course, that unless the population stopped growing so quickly, they would always be chasing the population growth curve, that exponential growth curve that we've seen in the past, the J curve, which we'll see again today. So they imposed population limits in the 1970s, where if you lived in the city, you could have one child, and if you lived in the country, you could have two. This actually worked incredibly. Today, China's population has peaked. That is that I think in 2021 is when China's population peaked, and now it's beginning to shrink. An interesting case directly south of China is Thailand. Thailand is a relatively big Southeast Asian country and also had a problem with a burgeoning population to the extent that, what do I mean by a problem? Why am I saying that people are a problem? They're not. What happens typically is that you have to look at the size of the economic system, how big it is. You have to look at what you might call the national territory, and then hope that in some ways the economic system is big enough to provide livelihood for everyone within the national territory. And in many developing countries, that's never true. It's not true in African countries that are very, very large, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is one of the biggest countries in Africa. Its capital city, Kinshasa, is at the mouth of the Congo River. Basically, it's a port on the Atlantic. But the easternmost parts of the DRC are all the way in East Africa, right up there with Rwanda and Burundi and Uganda. So it's very, very difficult to govern a space that large from Kinshasa. And as a result, it's difficult to see how you could have any policy in Kinshasa that would benefit or affect everyone within the boundaries of the DRC. So that is a dilemma for developing countries, particularly large ones, that the national space doesn't match the economic space. In other words, the economy is smaller. So the economy benefits urban dwellers. It benefits people that are in the modern sector, as it's called. And it doesn't benefit people who are outside the modern sector, which is often subsistence farmers and the urban poor. So what did Thailand do? Thailand implemented a voluntary system of birth control, meaning that they made birth control readily available to anyone. And what you see in this picture, oops, come on, okay, down there, thank you. Well, that's where Thailand is located. So you can see that we're looking at Southeast Asia. This is China. This is the Himalayan plateau, and these are the many countries of the Mekong Basin, which includes Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and formerly Burma. So Thailand is the biggest chunk of Southeast Asia. And so they implemented, these guys are actually very happy blokes, distributing condoms. So this is Makai Viravaidya, joined by Peter Plot, Executive Director of United Nations AIDS, left in passing out free condoms on Family Planning and AIDS Awareness Day in Bangkok. So in this case, they're addressing they're addressing two problems. One, or if you want to call them problems, they have two policies. One is, how do you reduce the rate of HIV transmission by encouraging the use of condoms? And at the same time, benefit from that by also reducing, since condoms are in fact prophylaxis against pregnancy, you would also be reducing the fertility rate. And Thailand succeeded, and at the same time that China did. So it's interesting, two East Asian countries, both wanting to address their burgeoning fertility rates, high fertility rates, and doing it through radically different methods. Now, of course, China is a much bigger country, and in terms of governing a national space, a real challenge, but they have nonetheless succeeded. So these are the human rights and educational opportunities for girls. This is the caption on page 79. Of the many United Nations conferences that have happened on population growth and fertility rates and so on, the one dimension, the one aspect that stands out consistently is that there is a strong, you could say, compelling correlation, if we want to sound scientific, meaning a correlation that is so strong that it obligates you to give it a close look. And that is the correlation between education for girls and drops in fertility rates. There are other, in fact, benefits to education of girls that go beyond a reduction in fertility rates. For example, infant mortality, which is a statistic used for a death rate under children under the age of 5. So that's considered, if a child dies under the age of 5, it's statistically part of the group called infant mortality. So Thailand managed to do both, to reduce fertility and to reduce infant mortality simply by the education of girls and having these voluntary programs. So we learn a lot from programs on population control, if you want to call it that. I don't like to call it that because it sounds Machiavellian, it sounds authoritarian, and in China it is. It often confuses the issue that you have a dystopian world where one extreme is the Malthusian scenario, too many people and not enough food, and the other extreme is a coercive science fiction world, where the state comes and takes away your second baby, right? I mean, there's movies about that, and then there's the famous movie Soylent Green, a cult film from back in my day, where there's so many people that they recycle and eat them, right? So what is Soylent Green? It's people. It's a really bad movie. So who are the classical economists, and why are we starting here? Because Thomas Malthus is one of the classical economists and had a lot to say about human population. In fact, he stands out in terms of classical economists by, in a sense, taking that on, making that his thing. So he writes something he calls an essay on population, a contribution to political economy, where he posits his theories about the problem, he sees this problematic, of human population growth. Now, Malthus is coming at a time when already John Stuart Mill and Adam Smith have written extensively on the wealth of nations and on, the understanding. Those are the preeminent economic philosophers of nascent capitalism. So they were looking at the system that was changing right under their feet, and they were trying their best to theorize it or to come up with ideas that would help that system develop and thrive. That's an important little detail, because all of these economists didn't call themselves economists. They called themselves natural philosophers, and their work was really, for the most part, philosophy. That is, that they looked at a very big picture. Unlike economics today, if you take a course in economics today, or or even business courses, the real focus is on prices, on supply and demand, on the nuts and bolts, things that can be quantified within a market system is really the focus of economics today. But in the 18th, 19th century, it was philosophy. In other words, how do we theorize this process that we're living? And it was a period of radical change, not in the sense that, well, you had the French Revolution, but not in the sense of political radical change, but of structural change. So the mercantilist period of European economic growth, which is a period in which the crown often took a leading role in creating charter companies that then became the extensions, the tentacles of their colonial octopus, right? So the settler colonies and charter companies become the method in which France and Britain in particular spread their colonial empires throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Other European powers that had had their heyday, like Spain, go into decline. So Spain, with all that huge territory of the Americas, and then some, actually becomes almost a pauper with the inability of Spain as an economy to take all the plunder it stole from the Americas and actually in some way invest it into a growing economy in Europe. They basically used the wealth of the Americas that they plundered for ostentatious display. So you can see all the beautiful churches and gold and everything in Spain, but what you don't see is any kind of nascent, robust economic system. It's a system of plunder and colonial exploitation. So Spain, now Portugal is an interesting exception. It's a small country, but with a huge empire, and manages to survive this period of mercantilism. In fact, it's built into to Portugal's global reach. So going back to John Stuart Mill and Adam Smith, they are the natural philosophers, that's what they call themselves, that are describing what should happen to make the economic system work better. Important little detail, because economics, in terms of what they were writing then, and maybe to this day, remains what I would call a normative science, meaning that in economics, you don't, for the most part, you don't look at the world the way it is. You look at the market system the way it should be. And then you pursue or outline policies that will get you to where you should be. Take, for example, concepts in classical economics that are with us to this day, but that are actually normative. Normative meaning it's a rule. Perfect competition, it's a concept in economics, which makes all kinds of assumptions about the marketplace and outlines what it thinks is the most important aspect of market success, and that is that entities be able to compete fairly and equally in the market. So perfect competition is where you don't have monopoly, you don't have monopsony, you don't have price fixing, you don't have all the things that we actually have. Right? Sovereign consumer, that consumers are in a unique position to make decisions in the marketplace, and that they do that as sovereign entities. In other words, that they're not being, in a sense, manipulated into certain patterns of consumption, or that they have full information when they approach the marketplace and make their choices. None of that is true. For the most part, none of us have perfect information. That's why we buy shit we don't like, right? Whoops, why did I buy this? It's terrible. And you don't have the sovereign consumer. But it's important to say you have one, because that, of course, focuses then the work of economists on what we could call the behavior of the sovereign consumer. And that's why behaviorism and consumer preferences and consumer behavior are so central to neoclassical economics today. But here we are looking at the classical economists. So all of these people create the formation of what later and more in the 20th century becomes neoclassical economics. So there's Thomas Malthus on his theories of population. David Ricardo, who's actually one of my favorite classical economists. Why? Because David Ricardo is really very popular with geographers. He's of all of these economists, he's the one that actually looked at the spatial limitations on markets and on growth and on economic activity. In some ways, he really appreciated the fact that everything has to take place, and place is geographic. So Ricardo brings up something the other blokes didn't look at. What is the value of land? How does a market system value land? And how does it do it over time? And what do changes in the valuation of land do to affect decision-making for all kinds of enterprises, starting with agriculture? So we owe a lot to David Ricardo in terms of what are called the theories of land rent, which stand in sharp contrast to Thomas Malthus's theory, which is basically sociobiology. It's a combination of biological projections and social behavior, which is why I don't like Thomas Malthus. And of course, I can't leave out Karl Marx. So Karl Marx is actually one of the classical economists. Now, he's unlike the others in that he was not a normative philosopher. In other words, Marx didn't try to set up what do we need to do policy-wise in order to create a more perfect market system. Marx takes the whole system on its head and says, what is this system? What is capitalism? And unlike the other philosophers of capitalism, Marx seems to have understood capitalism even better than they did, meaning that his only concern was how is it structured and what makes it run. And for Marx, what makes the capitalist system run, what makes all systems run, is the relationships between social classes. So in the case of Marx, that would be the owners of the factories or the land, the owners of what he called the means of production, and the workers who work in those. So for Marx, the central pivot, the central driving mechanism in capitalist markets is the conflict between the owners of the means of production and the workers. To use Marxist terms, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So Marx goes quite quite deeply into that. His theories basically gave birth to the whole field of sociology. He studied what makes peasants peasants, what makes industrial workers industrial workers. Now, Marx, a little bit like our dear friend Charles Darwin, was also a 19th century philosopher. So he too was very influenced by some of those currents in 19th century thinking, among those progressivism, that the world gets better, that things are gradual unless they have hiccups like revolutions, and that you could understand the world with the tools that Marx had set up, which is class analysis and structural economics. So Marx does stand out there, and he had his buddy, Frederick Engels, which is very fortuitous because Frederick Engels, unlike Karl Marx, was actually better off financially, came from a wealthy family. In fact, Frederick Engels' dad, I think, owned a factory or two. So it is interesting that Marx then gets a tour of Engels's dad's factories, where he's able to discern very detailed aspects of workers in a factory and what happens during the course of a day. It's interesting that the other economists didn't. For example, I think Adam Smith, no, Adam Smith writes Wealth of Nations, right? There's the famous pin factory, right? So it's not like John Stuart Mill and Adam Smith didn't look at production systems. They just focused on the wrong, well, no, the wrong, different aspects of what made it run. So we have that famous word widgets, and that's what classical economists came up with in trying to point out that there's some fungibility in capitalism when it comes to industrial production. That is, you could be making bunny rabbits, you could be making automobiles, you could be making computers. Those are the widgets. So they tried to distill from that what are the essential mechanisms in production, industrial production, making widgets, that explain either success or costs or failure, et cetera. So taken as a whole, these are really the classical economists. Unfortunately, I think in economics departments, and when students take courses in economics or the history of economics, they often leave out Karl Marx, and meaning that the publishers or the authors do. And that has a lot to do with American aversion to Marx and Marxism, which is very, very, very deep. It's unfortunate that it's deep because if you travel anywhere else in the world, literally anywhere else in the world, you'll find that people are actually quite well versed on Karl Marx. It doesn't mean that they're Marxists. It just means they understand his contribution to political economy. They also understand his criticism of capitalism. So it's unfortunate because we live in the capitalist system par excellence, some say. The United States is the most capitalist of capitalist countries, and yet we don't understand our system very well at all. Which is why when I read, the debates going on in the political campaigns this year as to whether the economy is doing well or not doing well, so that if you follow some of the statistics that you get from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Council on Economic Advisors and so on, and not to mention the stock market itself, the economy is doing quite well and has been since Biden has been in the White House. In other words, a lot of the policies that Biden and his economic advisors have implemented were designed to prevent skyrocketing inflation, because inflation is sort of the ultimate thief. If people are experiencing an increase in wages, which they're able to do when there's shortages in labor markets, which we have now, then workers are in a much better position to demand higher wages. And they are, which is why we have a renewed interest on the part of younger workers today in the United States in joining labor unions. Trader Joe's and Starbucks want to have unions, which is somewhat surprising because those are considered service sectors, part of the service economy. And the service economy is not known for either radicalism in the workplace or even very strong feelings about unionization. But that's changed. And so that today the service employees are in fact the fastest growing sector of organized labor. We even include, teaching assistants at UCLA. So this renewed interest in organized labor has to do with an effort by working people to increase to keep their income commensurate with the cost of living, which it really hasn't done. And one of the sad things about our economic system is that in capitalist economics, you're often told that wages rise with rises in productivity. So to the extent that workers become more productive, then they're in a position to demand higher wages, and they do that. And so you have this sort of interesting relationship between wage increases and productivity increases. However, in the United States, since 1970, It's a long time ago. Wages have not kept up with productivity. The gap between how much more workers have become in terms of productivity and their wages has grown and grown and grown, which explains why there's so much bitterness on the part of working people toward the economy as a whole. Now, how they channel that bitterness, how they express it, has the full range of, Gen Z wanting to join a labor union and people voting for Donald Trump. So Americans are often clueless in terms of expressing their differences with the economic system. And I would just submit to you, part of that is we don't understand our economic system very well at all. We understand aspects of it. And to the extent that we think we've been affected by that aspect, then we have strong opinions. For example, take globalism. Globalism was the emergence of a much more integrated trade-based economic system in the later part of the 20th century. And it was embraced by the corporate world because they could have what's called the global reach. So multinational corporations were the centerpiece of globalism in the late 20th century. And with that, you got what we call footloose capital, meaning you could show up to work one morning and find a padlock on the chain link fence. And what you didn't know is the company closed the plant while you were asleep and they moved everything to Mexico or they moved everything to China. And that was the center of the bitterness of particularly industrial workers in the United States as we got the deindustrialization of the American economy, meaning the industrial sector got smaller and smaller, the service and financial sector got bigger and bigger. So it behooves us to study economics, but this is, of course, an environmental science. So let's take, I do want to mention John Maynard Keynes, who is considered by some economists to be in many ways a classical economist, to the extent that he's also a philosopher. And we owe what you might call the resuscitation of the capitalist system in the 20th century to the work of John Maynard Keynes, who was a British economist and was the architect of what became Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and became the sharpest critic of laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire, nice French word, means let do, laissez. So laissez-faire is let the market work it out. Don't intervene in prices and wages. Don't intervene in the marketplace. The government should take a back seat to the marketplace. That's laissez-faire economics. And that's what got us the Great Depression, the big one in the 1920s. And that's when John Maynard Keynes' work becomes significant, his rebuttal of laissez-faire economics. And so the population dynamics we'll look at is the myth of Malthusian dilemma and the reality of what here, and fortunately in our book, is referred to as demographic change. So one of my guiding lights when I look at issues on population is to what extent are the authors or the opinion makers using the word demography or demographic? Because demography is the scientific study of human populations. I would say human populations. I've seen in our book it says that there's demographics for non-humans. Well, I suppose if you're using the tools of demography, then yeah, you could potentially apply that to other species. But what we really think of, a demo in and of itself means, the people, right? So it's graphing the human population. What we see in Malthusian economics is that the growth of human population is exponential, and that agriculture is not. That agriculture can only produce in an arithmetic or linear fashion. Malthus refers to that intersection of exponential growth of human beings with the linear output of agriculture as the famine point. In other words, that's the point at which the human population is larger than the ability of agriculture to feed it. Somebody's going to die of starvation. So said Malthus. Ricardo challenges that and says Malthus doesn't understand agriculture, which is true. He didn't. I don't know what Malthus did understand. I do have a colleague who loves Thomas Malthus and considers him a very important economist. Maybe there were other contributions that Malthus made that I'm overlooking, but what we know him for is Malthusian economics and the Malthusian dilemma. Too many people, not enough, fill in the blank. Not enough space, not enough housing, not enough food. And it has very important ideological value in a capitalist economy because in a sense, it blames poor people for their poverty. It blames the size of their families, right? And that's why no matter how wrong Thomas Malthus is, we cannot kick this idea out of the room, even though he was wrong when he was writing, which is a long time ago. So that's why I like Ricardo's theory of agricultural output and land rents. So this is Malthus's dilemma. Human population grows, that's the y-axis. Time is the x-axis. The exponential growth curve is human numbers, and agricultural output, according to Malthus, is linear, arithmetic. So you can only incrementally add acreage and increase output from agriculture. That totally overlooked what's called the intensification of agriculture, which is what agriculture always is. Farmers are always trying to find a way to get more out of the same amount of land. That's the definition of intensification. But Malthus doesn't look at that. And in fact, what we find is that Malthus was actually an employee of the East India Company. That's one of those charter companies that was created by the British Crown in order to extend the tentacles of the British Empire to India, to the Hindustan. And so he went to India. And what he saw in India was a lot of famine and starvation. Why? Because the British had completely disrupted the Indian economy. They disrupted the agrarian system completely. And so you did have a lot of very poor people who were starving to death. But Malthus, knowing who's paying his bill, knowing who's paying his check, blames it on the Indian people themselves. Then he turns around and does exactly the same thing to Ireland. So he was, in many ways, a I'm going to use a really bad word here. So he was basically pimping out his services to the ruling class. In other words, the landed class, the people who owned land. And why that is particularly repulsive is that then Malthus goes and opposes two very important cornerstones of what John Stuart Mill and Adam Smith were supporting. One of those is free trade, and the other one is that there be some kind of safety net for the poor. The safety net for the poor in Great Britain at the time were called the Poor Laws. And the Poor Laws were actually ways in which the church took tithings from parishioners and then would, for example, acquire food and distribute that to people who were, landless or who were starving. So the Poor Laws was a way of creating sort of a welfare system for the poorest people in Britain. The other thing that happened was that with free trade, you could import grains from, say, France that were cheaper and better than the grains you were growing in Britain. Now, for the classical economists, this has something to do with what they called comparative advantage. In other words, if another country is better at growing something or producing something than you are, then it's in your interest to trade with that country and import what they're doing better than you do and dedicate your resources to something else, to something where you have a comparative advantage. So it was particularly for those economies that are not too far apart from each other. So to what extent the law or the theory of comparative advantages was applied to the colonial reach of France or Britain, I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think they were saying that what they were doing in the case of colonial reach was just downright exploitation, extraction. How much can we basically rip off? So this is interesting because, as David Ricardo points out, Malthus is wrong about agricultural output. The agricultural output when Malthus was writing was greater than the population. And here's the big one, it always has been. That is what the Malthusians and the neo-Malthusians refuse to understand. Agricultural output and food production on planet Earth have always been greater, I would say much greater, than human population. So then the issue comes up with, then why are people hungry? Why are they malnourished? Why are there famines? It's a very good question. But Malthus is not the answer. It's not because there's too many people. And so we're seeing in this particular chapter are things that I would like to consider the causes of what are called persistent high fertility, meaning that there are regions in the world where people are still having, if fertility is measured, it's measured in something called the total fertility rate, the TFR. A total fertility rate greater than 2 is a population that will grow. Total fertility rate that is 2 is called replacement, and less than 2, then the population shrinks. So in persistent high fertility are those regions in the world where the fertility rate is way up there, like 5. And then the causes of that, they're known as proximate causes and distant causes. To look at this, we have to look at the status of women and reproductive choice. Today, the United States is reducing reproductive choice for women. Incredible thing that's happening in this country, but it's happening. Women in education, which we've seen is a very compelling correlation. The demographic transition, which is really the pivot point of this whole chapter. Global fertility decline, and that's what we're seeing today. Coercive and voluntary birth control, which we've talked about just now with China and Thailand. The Japan dilemma, or what's called the geriatric society, where increasing percentage of your population is over the age of 60. And that is very much, that's a much bigger challenge than too many children, is too many old people. And Japan is facing that today. Urbanization and irreversible decline. We are now an urban species for the first time in the entire natural history of Homo sapiens sapiens, or all the hominids. Humans now, most humans live in cities, and that happened in our lifetimes. It happened about 10 years ago. So that's very important because people in cities have small families. They typically do have replacement rate. They have 1 or 2 kids for all kinds of good reasons. And then finally, the problem of the geriatric society. So looking at population growth over time here, what you're seeing going back to 1800, mind you that when Malthus is writing, the population of the world, of the planet, is under 1.65 billion people. It reaches 1.65 billion in 1900. Malthus was dead by then. So here he is jumping up and down, having a hissy fit over there being too many people, and he's writing at a time where there aren't even a billion people. And today we are 8 billion people. Are we all dying of starvation? No. Today, the Earth produces enough food to feed 10 billion people. That's already in production. That isn't a projection. And we've just broken the threshold, I think, January 1st, 2024, of 8 billion people. So, in other words, we produce more than enough food. In fact, if anything, one of the characteristics of capitalist economic systems is what Marx called overproduction. And overproduction is built into modern consumer capitalism. Just consider a walk through a supermarket and how much stuff is in there and how much of it is going to have to be thrown out. I mean, you go to the meat department and look at the sell-by dates, and you pick up a piece of chicken and it's sell-by today. What's going to happen to that piece of chicken at the end of the day? It's going in the dumpster. That's overproduction. And it's a way of controlling prices. It's a way of, for competing entities like retail corporations, like supermarkets, it's a way to attract customers to your store, and it's a way to depress prices. It's a way to compete. If you have overproduction, meaning you're also over-inventoried, then you can play with that when it comes to undercutting your competitors. One of the things I like about Trader Joe's, even though there's a lot to not like, but it's one of my favorite companies to examine, because it's gone through interesting changes. But I would say that Trader Joe's, in a way, revolutionized the supermarket in the United States. Actually, I think they started in Germany, but Coulomb actually started Pasadena. The first Trader Joe's was in Pasadena, and he had already worked as a manager of many, many 7-Elevens. So Coulomb took his experience in managing small stores, which were often attached to gas stations, and learned a whole lot about how they inventory and how they sell stuff. And then he just basically scaled it up to Trader Joe's. But there's a lot to go into that one. But Trader Joe's has no coupons, no discounts, no sales. There's no favored brand. It's all the same brand. Maybe occasionally you might get, can of coffee that isn't Trader Joe's coffee. And in that way, they not only get a smaller store, but they can focus on quality for price. So Trader Joe's consumers like the fact that the quality is generally good, better than, Ralph's and Safeway, meaning a lot of it is organic. There's no radiated foods. There's no genetically modified organisms at Trader Joe's, which go to the other stores and there is. So that kind of consumer that's very conscious in terms of their selections, like Trader Joe's, because the prices are actually pretty good. The LA Times did a study of all food retailers during the inflation boom, which was last year and the year before. And the only store chain that was not raising its prices concomitant with the others was Trader Joe's. All the other ones, they did the standard, what economists do. They take a basket, the shopping basket, and they put in it what they consider to be the standard basket. How much is butter, dairy, meat, starches, fresh fruit, vegetables, etc. And then they price it and say, okay, the price went up. Not at Trader Joe's. So I asked them, why is that? And the person I was talking to, what's interesting about Trader Joe's is the employees know a lot about the store. That isn't true at Ralph's. It isn't true at Whole Foods. They know a lot about the store. They know about the inventory. They know what's been discontinued. They know what's being introduced. They can answer a whole bunch of questions. So I asked, well, what's the deal? Everybody else's prices are rising. Why haven't yours? And they said, well, because we actually have a whole lot in the supply chain in terms of where they source their food, and that they'd already purchased that. So they didn't need to pass on increased cost to the consumer in the form of raised prices. And the guy warned me, said, but wait, when that supply chain is used up, then our sourcing companies are going to raise the wholesale price, and then the retail price will match that. But in terms of the difference between the wholesale price and the retail price, Trader Joe's has very small margins. So that it's an interesting experiment in retail. Anyway, off topic. So here you can see the global growth rate as a percentage per year, and then global population in two colors, the pink one meaning right up until 2018, looks like, 2017, and then the projected all the way to 2100. So this projection, which is world population prospects from the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs Population Division, UN. I take big issue with it because it suggests here that by the end of the 21st century, we'll have reached 11.2 billion people. And that this is a weird graph because it doesn't match any of the other graphs in this chapter, and it doesn't match the graph that they presented at the beginning of the book, which has us leveling off, meaning peaking below 9 billion, somewhere between 8 and 9 billion, which, by the way, is a more modest projection than what was the projection not long ago of 10 billion. And that's because global fertility rates are plummeting, which means projections based on existing fertility rates back in the 1980s and 90s are wrong, because surprisingly, fertility rates have dropped very quickly all over the world. So that would then cause us to question this projection of 11.2 billion, which is a lot of people. If anything, we'll probably peak somewhere at about 9 billion, and then we'll actually begin to see a decline. So there is an interesting concept in demographics, which is how long does it take a population of a country to double in its size, which is based usually on looking at the fertility rate. So what you see here is progress between 5,000 years before the current era to the year 2050 as an estimate. So they notice that for population for 2050, it has the estimate at 8.9 billion. That is a projection, but it flies in the face of the one we just saw, which was more, let me see, what do they have for 2050? They have 9.2 billion. Looking at these different periods of time, it tells you, you can see this incredible growth of the human population. From 100 million 800 years ago, we break the billion mark in 1900, which is pretty recent. So then it asks the question, what's the doubling time? How long does it take that population to double in size? And you can see that the doubling time for in other words, the fastest growing populations for the globe happened between 1965 and 2000, where you have a doubling time of 33 years and 51 years, respectively. And this is a picture of people, somewhere enjoying what looks to be a nice sunny day somewhere. It looks like California. I don't know why I think it's California. Actually, I think it's UC Berkeley. But anyway, notice that there's a lot of people. Now, yes, it's a nice spring or summer crowd. Why is it? Here we go. Now that unless you're claustrophobic, there's nothing particularly scary about all those people. But the neo-Malthusians, so now let's leave Thomas Malthus aside. By the way, Thomas Malthus, what did he attribute high fertility rates to? He was a parson. A parson is a lay clergyman. So he was in the church. Thomas Malthus blamed the passion of the sexes on why there's such high fertility rates. He looked at Ireland and he said, all these Irish people do is spend their day planting their potatoes, and then they go at sunset into their little hovels, their little cabins. They go and make more babies, and then they go back out and grow more potatoes, and round we go, a family of 14 children, all starving to death and living from potatoes. That was how Malthus saw Irish people, as basically animals. as amoebas in a petri dish, as rabbits in a warren. In fact, those of us who don't like Malthusian theories often refer to them as rabbit theorists. Their whole theory is based on doubling time for rabbit populations. So they ignore the fact that human beings have always intervened in fertility. It's the distinctive aspect of humans in all societies, pre-industrial, that a control of fertility was an essential part of the way they organized themselves. Now, you could even argue that some animal populations also have a control of fertility to the extent that you might have a structure in which the alpha male dominates all the females. So that is going to limit access to the females by other males. That might have the net effect of actually controlling the fertility of all the females in the harem of the elephant seal, the alpha male elephant seal. But with humans, it's far more detailed. It has to do with when do humans consider it okay for younger people to have families, to have children. And that's governed by religious practices, by cultural traditions, by class. And when you put together all the factors that contribute to humans' fertility decision-making, that is what demographers refer to that as fertility decision-making. It's complicated as hell because a lot of it has to do with what is the status of women. Are women basically chattel? Are they find themselves in arranged marriages the way it does with the upper classes in South Asia? Are they free to choose their mates the way it was before patriarchy? And it's complicated because the structure by gender of different societies differs quite a bit, even today. And the result of it is that there's different approaches to fertility decision making. If women have more freedom to make their own decision as to how many kids they want, chances are, and all the data shows, that they would rather have a small family than a large family. So that is why the whole idea of a crowded world was what Garrett Hardin and Paul Ehrlich, 1970s neo-Malthusians, used as their cudgel. What they did was they abandoned Malthus's focus on sex. Malthus said it's the passion of the sexes. These people just can't stop fucking. And the neo-Malthusians said, no. We've exceeded the carrying capacity of the planet. They brought, instead of morality, they brought science to their argument. In other words, they scientized Malthus. They made it more acceptable because it seemed to be based on something that's quantifiable and neutral. Science. Right? And that's where we get this very interesting concept of what is the carrying capacity of planet Earth regarding human beings, and have we exceeded it? In very simple terms, yes, we exceeded it in 1970 when we had our first overshoot day. Now, was that a function of human population or a function of human economics? No, it's a function of human economics. That by then the global economy had grown to the size where, in fact, we could have a big impact on whether the economy could meet the needs of all people or not. But that excess population, which Karl Marx called the surplus population. In other words, Marx attacked Malthus and said, Malthus is wrong. This is not the dynamics of human population. But in capitalist systems, there will always be a portion of the population that's unemployed. And Marx called that the reserve army of labor. That as long as there's a chunk of the population that's unemployed, employers, the owners of the means of production, can then fire people willy-nilly, can depress their wages. In other words, the rates of exploitation are higher when there's a big pool of unemployed people to take your place. One of the things that's frustrating capitalists in the United States today is that the unemployment rate is very low. It's so low that the reserve army of labor is not readily available to take the place of fired workers. That put workers in a bargaining position with management that basically suggests, okay, go ahead and fire me. Let's see, how your company does then. And I find that exquisitely interesting because one of the ways in which the United States solves, well, I won't say solves the problem. One of the ways in which the United States has a growing reserve army of labor is through immigration. So you would think that from the point of view of the investor class, of the owners of the means of production, immigration in the United States is always good. You're going to have more workers, and you want more workers because you don't want zero unemployment. It's interesting that are what's her name, Janet Yellen, and the head of the Fed. I don't know why his name is escaping me. They were both very influenced by the work of Milton Friedman, who was the economist that informed Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Friedmanism, Milton Friedman was responsible for what's called the Chicago School of Economics, which emphasizes free trade and laissez-faire economics and privatization, et cetera, low taxes, all the things that we've gotten with the conservative revolution 40 years ago that are with us to this day really can be attributed to Milton Friedman. So it's interesting that the head of the Federal Reserve Bank today and Janet Yellen were acolytes of Milton Friedman. So I was very worried when the Fed was announcing that it was going to raise interest rates and that it was going to continue to raise interest rates every quarter until we could stem the inflationary bubble, the inflationary curve. My big concern was I know these guys, and I think if I've read their work, they welcome a recession because a recession is a shakeout of the labor market. And if you're shaking out the labor market, that means you're increasing the number of unemployed people and you succeed in depressing wages. And if you can depress wages, then you can actually attack inflation. Their theory, wrong as it is that inflation is caused by rising wages, which it isn't, by the way. Not, well, it can be, but not in most cases it isn't. So I was really worried. I'm glad that that the Fed succeeded in stemming the inflationary flow without a recession. So now I'm revising my opinion of it's not Bernanke, whatever his name is, Fed Reserve Bank, that maybe they didn't want a recession. Maybe they're no longer Milton Friedman-esque in welcoming basically what's called the shock doctrine. The shock doctrine is a policy that was implemented in Chile under Augusto Pinochet when he overthrew the democratically elected president Salvador Allende. And he brought in to Chile a whole bunch of economists from the Chicago School. They were called the Chicago Boys, and they were all acolytes of Milton Friedman. And they implemented in Chile what they wanted to implement in the United States. Shock doctrine is where the dislocation as a result of policy is so great that people, their heads are spinning. They're shocked. And when you can put a chunk of the population into basically a state of shock, you can manipulate the hell out of it. You can impose policies that they would never tolerate in a million years, and suddenly they're tolerating the policies. So I was afraid that maybe, our Federal Reserve Bank and Janet Yellen wanted to give us a little bit of shock. But no, they didn't. We succeeded in reducing inflation in the United States sooner than any Western European country has. By the way, they're still looking at a combination of deflation and inflation. Their economic systems are not working as well as the U.S. right now. Right now, in terms of modern capitalist economies, the U.S. is doing the best. And yet you have all this dissatisfaction. Brookings Institution just did a report asking the question, why are so many Americans so dissatisfied with the economy when all the indicators are so good? And that's a really good question, because what it suggests is that indicators by themselves do not reflect people's experience or what they sense or perceive to be the reality of the marketplace. There's a gap, there's a disconnect between people's perceptions of what's happening economically and what economic indicators show as far as growth rate, unemployment rate, new jobs. Biden has broken every record in terms of new jobs per quarter, per month, and yet people seem to be very dissatisfied. This shows you the growth of the human population through going way back 500,000 years ago. So the agricultural revolution here is put somewhere around 8,000 BC. By the way, the term that's really used today in science and is BCE, because BC means before Christ, and BCE means before the current era. So the current era begins with AD, Anno Domini, right? And that is where Jesus was born, and then that's where the Western calendars start their year zero, right? At the birth of Christ. So current, you'll see that a lot. BCE means before the current era, and the current era begins with 1 AD. So there's a break in the line. Obviously, that's what you see at the bottom there is the two. This indicates in any graphic that there's a break in the timeline or a break in the data. So in other words, these are increasing by thousands of years, 1,000 years, 1,000, and this one is 8,000 years. So that's the gap. So you begin to see the human population goes through fits and starts. It's always under 1 billion people. It's always under 500 million people, and that's for the whole planet. And then here is AD. So this is Roman Empire time. And interestingly, then somewhere around 1300 to 1400, you have the Great Plagues of Europe, the bubonic plague known as the Black Death. And there's a notch. That's a big die-off of humans. But once the plagues were over, the population growth rate recovered, and then you have the big change with the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution, it's attributed to about 1750, where it really begins to be something you can quantify, is responsible for the J curve. Why it's called the J curve? Because it looks like the letter J. So then by the year 1900, we're at 1 billion people. And today, even this one has it, by the year 2000, we were at 7 billion people. And by 2024, we're at 8 billion people. So that is a very large growth in the human population in a very short period of time. This is why the neo-Malthusians got people's attention. One is they dropped Malthus's obsession with sex, and they made it a science of exceeding carrying capacity. So one of those neo-Malthusians is Garrett Hardin. I was a student at UC Santa Barbara when he was very famous. And I'm glad I never took his class. I didn't know what a rotten stinker he was. All I knew was that by the time I was doing environmental studies at UC Santa Cruz at Berkeley, every student in environmental studies had to read an essay called The Tragedy of the Commons. It's the most read English language text in environmental studies in the United States and maybe even Canada, is Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, published in 1968. And what's interesting about it is that the Commons was the system that existed in Britain prior to the enclosure. And the enclosure was a process whereby the landed aristocracy, working with the British Parliament, fundamentally transformed rural land use. In other words, the landowners that were renting land to peasants. So you might have even seen this sort of in Monty Python sketches, where the peasant is growing crops and they pay in kind, meaning they take about 25% of what they grew and they pay that to the landlord as rent. So you had then the 4-field and 3-field system, and you had subsistence peasants living off what they could grow and paying rent in kind to their landlords. In other words, the landlord is getting paid in oats or barley or wheat, which is not exactly, I mean, obviously they can sell that. It's a commodity, but it's not going to buy them a new palace. So once the landed aristocracy of Britain began to see what they could get if they were richer, they thought, well, if we grow sheep, if we grow wool, we can sell the wool to what was then the nascent textile mills of Lancaster, and we can make a lot more money than getting paid in barley and oats. So the enclosure was a system whereby the landed gentry of Britain evicted the peasants off the land, and they did that with acts of parliament. So they, being a aristocratic country, they used their political power in London and got the parliament to actually make it legal to remove the peasants. And then they planted hedgerows, which are these, lovely little English countryside feature that everybody loves, hedgerows, but they were built to keep out people and to keep in the sheep. And that created the early relationship between landed aristocracy and industrialization, because now they were growing wool and not grains. But you can see then why, Malthus steps in when this is happening and says, you got to get rid of the poor laws. The poor laws means that you feed hungry people food and they have more babies. They have more babies, there's more poor people. More poor people, you have to feed them more food. And round you go, you're constantly feeding this burgeoning population of poor people. The best thing you can do, ... is let them starve. That is what Thomas Malthus called nature's check on the profligacy of human beings. Remember, he's a parson, and for him, it all has its origin in sex. Therefore, it's icky. That's what an evil guy Thomas Malthus was. Let them die. I had a student at UC Berkeley who was so Malthusian, and I taught a course, an upper division course in the geography department at UC Berkeley called Population, Resources, and Development, which is why I know a little bit too much about this topic. And he was so adamant to defend Malthusian thinking that he said, what we have to do today is conventional warfare against the world's poor. We have to eliminate them. I had a long talk with a student. I think he was, a real sick piece of work. He wasn't at all concerned for the morality of it, because one of the things that Garrett Hardin and Paul Ehrlich managed to do was to shift people's moral and ethical concerns. And basically, especially Garrett Hardin, is saying if you're soft-hearted, you're basically committed suicide. This takes hard-nosed decision-making. So the other thing he wrote was something called lifeboat ethics. Lifeboat ethics is the ship has gone down, take Titanic. The rich are in the lifeboats, of course. I love his metaphor. His metaphor assumes immediately that the rich are in a position to kill the poor. The poor are in the water. So the question is, do you take them onto your boat and swamp the boat and everybody drowns? Or do you fend them off with the oars and let them drown? And Garrett Hardin's lifeboat ethics was you let them drown. So that Malthusian idea, the darkest side of Thomas Malthus, did not go away with Thomas Malthus. You could probably see it in its quintessence in Nazi Germany, where a particularly dark ecologist by the name of Ratzel influences Adolf Hitler profoundly. Ratzel proposed that every people think the way that they think of people, think race, needs their living space, their Lebensraum. So that Lebensraum for the Deutsche Volk wasn't only Germany. There's a chunk of Poland, a chunk of Czechoslovakia, the Sudeten, all of these different places that Hitler expanded into to secure enough national territory for German people, and in the process evict all the non-Germans. Think of what he did to the Jewish population, but also to the Roma people and to the disabled people and to the elderly. And the killing machine in Nazi Germany spared nobody. They killed gay people, they killed everybody. And why? Because they had a genocidal theory of racial superiority, and they believed that the only way that German people could survive is by eliminating all of those non-German people in the Deutsche Lebensraum. So that is Malthus in an extreme. And that's why people who defend Malthus, like Garrett Hardin and Paul Ehrlich, have never been called to task on their theory. The logical endpoint of their theory is genocide. They stop short of that. They just tell you, here's the dilemma. Look at the dilemma. Look at the dilemma. Look. Look at the curve. Look at the J curve. How many people? Oh my God, there's so many people. There's so many people. And they stop at that because now they've got you by your attention. Now you're paying attention because they're screaming and yelling. But we find out later, thanks to Scientific American, that this creep, Garrett Hardin, was a eugenicist, that he was a heavy-duty Islamophobe, he was a nativist, and I found this with all Malthusians. Malthusians believe that European people are better and that they are more, well, as Malthus himself said, the rich are more restrained in their behavior, which is why he believed that the poor laws were bad, because the aristocracy was better at being human than the peasants. And the other thing I forgot to mention is that Malthus opposed free trade with France. In other words, he thought that the British should block or put a tariff on French wheat, which raises the price of food, which means more people starve, but absolutely irresponsible. And that's what we're stuck with when we look at this legacy of the neo-Malthusians, in this case, Garrett Hardin. Paul Ehrlich, not so bad, not as bad as Garrett Hardin, but I was glad that finally, in a very reputable journal, the truth about this man came out. With 4 billion people by 2100, the world's population could be cut in half by the end of the century. So what are we seeing? The opposite of what our book just showed us, that by the end of the century, we'll have declined all the way down to 4 billion. And that is a very serious projection based on a lot of data and trends, including the decline in fertility throughout the world. So this is when, it's Lloyd Alter, I like him. This is from, Star Trek. These weren't Triffids. There was a name for these. They multiply like crazy on the ship. So the UN then revised its population projections downward. And then you have, from this article in Medium, there's your sheep theory, that the whole morality question. So there's something in this article I want you to see. It's so important to see it. Scroll, and here it is. This is the percentage of carbon dioxide emissions by world population. Notice that a lot of people that talk about climate will say there's too many people. Really? The richest 10% of the planet is responsible for half of the total lifestyle consumption emissions. Now, lifestyle consumption emissions have to do with the way that people expand their so-called carbon footprint. In other words, it's not a comprehensive measure, but it's important because it's basically half. And then you can see the funnel get smaller and smaller. The poorest 50% are responsible for only 10% of total lifestyle consumption emissions on the planet. The poorest 50%. So are there too many people or are there too many rich people? Let you think about that one. And so this is what Paul Ehrlich, in contrast to Garrett Hardin, proposed as a way of understanding population dynamics. What happened with Paul Ehrlich, who's I think still alive, a professor emeritus at Stanford University, and his wife, they co-authored two books. The first book he wrote was called The Population Bomb. No, yes, which was projecting into the future what would happen, a classic neo-Malthusian piece. And the second he wrote in the 1990s is called The Population Explosion. In other words, the bomb went off. So Ehrlich has not backed down from his neo-Malthusian posturing. The only thing he did, and I think he probably listened to his wife on this one, is you can't leave out the rich people, the ones we just saw. So he comes up with this formula with, I think, Holdren, professor of energy resources group at UC Berkeley. So Holdren and Paul Ehrlich come up with this formula. The formula is called IPAT. So you can see it at the top. Impact equals population times affluence times technology. So finally, a neo-Malthusian points out that the consumption habits of rich people have a far greater impact on environment than population alone. So they've added technology and affluence. So that is Ehrlich's way of updating his theories, and he did it through this formula called IPAT. Now, there's a lot wrong with IPAT, but at the very least, it acknowledges that not all humans are exactly the same. All 8 billion of us are not equally responsible for the climate crisis or the biodiversity loss. It's definitely not an even playing field. And in this picture, what you're seeing is two demographic worlds, one that is technologically advanced and has an elderly population that is growing slowly, if at all. The other is poor, crowded, and underdeveloped and growing rapidly. So this book still hangs on to some of this imagery. In this case, this is exactly what Garrett Hardin experienced in India when he wrote his book on the tragedy of the commons. By the way, what is the tragedy of the commons? Well, according to Garrett Hardin, before you kick the peasants off the land, they would graze their animals on land that was held in common. It wasn't owned by anybody, and they overgrazed it, so they destroyed it, and in the process, they lost all their animals. And Garrett Hardin says, "You see, that's what happens when you don't have private property." So that's how reactionary he was. He was not only a eugenicist, a racist to the bone, and a cynic, because remember, lifeboat ethics is let them die. But he also then posits that there's too many of them. So he's in India, and there's the beggars are sticking their hands through the window in Calcutta, and they're asking him for rupees, and he has a moment of claustrophobia. I would say a moment where a white supremacist has claustrophobia because all those hands are brown, right? So he's freaking out. There's too many Hindus. There's too many Indians. Look at the sacred cows. He's having a fit over all the bicycles in Calcutta. I got out at the train station in Amsterdam a long time ago, backpacking through Europe, that kind of thing. And it was crowded. Okay, it was so crowded that it took me a long time to get from that wonderfully ornate railroad station in Amsterdam to the little canal or big canal where my hotel was. It took a long time because it was so crowded. Now, did I have a Garrett Hardin moment and say, oh my God, there's too many Dutch people? No. And Holland is one of the densest countries in the world. If any of you have traveled to New York, you know that an aspect of particularly Manhattan is that it's pretty crowded. You get on the subway and everybody's on the subway. Wall Street brokers, homeless people, everybody in New York rides the subway. In Manhattan, you can't afford to drive your car around. And they mingle. New Yorkers are interesting because they bump into each other a lot, okay? And they're not like Californians who have a hissy fit if you're within 4 feet of a Californian, you've interrupted their personal space. I'm always amazed at how disintimate Californians are. They really have a phobia of how close you can get to them. But New Yorkers, they bump into each other and they don't say sorry. They just bump into each other. And that can be a guy in a three-piece suit with his Wall Street Journal folded over looking at a stock report. And he's a strap hanger, meaning he's hanging on the subway to those little straps. And right next to him is a guy who hasn't had a shower in 2 weeks. That's New York. Are there too many New Yorkers? No. Are there too many Dutch people? No. And those are very densely populated places. But Garrett Hardin looks at India and he says, oh my God, there's too many of them. And that's exactly what Thomas Malthus did when he looked at India. These are called population pyramids. They're used by demographers to break down a population by two criteria, by gender and age. So here you're looking at 3 different countries. On the left is a rapidly growing population, and the case study is Niger in Africa. The stable population in the middle is Sweden, and the declining population is Singapore. So what makes for a growing population, rapidly growing, is what's called a bottom-heavy pyramid, meaning that if you look at that group between 0 and 20 years, that's the bulk of the population in Niger. One of the things that really strikes you traveling in developing countries, but particularly in Africa, is how many young people there are. We're getting used to the fact that as our population ages, more and more of the people that we encounter every day are older. But you visit many African countries and many Central American countries, and you see a lot of young people. Now, that is actually, by any measure, a good thing. It means that they have a future. I worry about Singapore and Japan because what future do they have with no young people? They don't have kids. So now the downside is what's called a demographic lag. So let's say tomorrow morning, Niger was to reach replacement rate, like China with a 2.0 TFR. Would the population stop growing? No. The population would continue to grow because all of these under the age of 16 might not have children yet. So even if they replace themselves, meaning if they only have 2 kids, that group at the bottom there from 0 to 5 is they're showing you is what 20% of the population. Even if they replace themselves within 40 years, you'll have a doubling time. The population will double. That's called demographic lag, where changes in fertility rates are not reflected in declines in population for some time. It's a lag time. The other form of lag in demography is cultural lag. Cultural lag is interesting because that's when social conditions have changed radically to the point where what used to influence people's fertility decision-making no longer obtains. And yet they continue to practice or make decisions around fertility that really belong to a previous era. You could say that's very true in China. The revolution in China turned the entire society inside out and upside down. They eliminated the aristocracy and the landed classes, the landlords. They eliminated them, right, very violently. And as a result, they have a revolution that promised, anyway, equality, particularly for men and women. But in China today, young people still want to have a son because of the 1- and 2-child policies. So if the government says you can only have 1 kid and live in the city, they want a son. So women will go to an OBGYN, they'll get their amnio or their sonogram, they'll see that the fetus is female, and they'll choose to abort. So gender-based abortion is quite common in China. And it's because of the 1- and 2-child policies. So you can see that despite its success in limiting the growth of population in China, which has allowed that country to flourish economically like it would not have had they not addressed burgeoning population, has a lot of dark sides. And among those is gender-based abortion. India has the same problem. India has laws against it. It's very unscrupulous OBGYNs in India that will tell you the gender of your fetus. So in India, it's also practiced. These are cultural lags. Now in India, it's much more patriarchal a society. It's a lot more uneven than China is in terms of gender. So even upper middle class people choose to have sons. If they want to limit the size of their family, they choose to have sons. So that in China has caused a problem because the natural break in gender is 51-49. That the natural population breakdown is 51% female, 49% male. That's the way it is in all natural populations in most countries. But if you have gender-based abortion, then you're skewing that ratio. So now there's more males than females. There's 52% male and 48% female, which means that a lot of young men in China can't find mates. They can't find somebody to marry and raise children with. This is a real problem in China, and they're trying to educate people to welcome having a daughter. They even have billboards in Beijing showing, extolling the virtues of having a girl. And that's because this cultural lag has skewed their population to the point where they have to import brides. My niece worked in Beijing for a while for the French oil company. She said, you'd be surprised. They actually are the way that Americans, listen to these stupid internet ads of, some Russian girl wants to be your wife. In China, it's Laotian. So Laotian and Cambodian women are imported into China for young men to have mates, to have a partner to raise a family with. So that's very interesting. That's what happens when you have a policy that might in fact be well intended, might even be important, and still it has this unintended consequence. The intention of 1 and 2 child policies was not to create a China with more boys than girls. Sweden, it looks like the walls are vertical, and that's because if you look at that distribution of or males and females in Sweden all the way up to the age of 90, it's pretty even. Notice that when you get to countries like Sweden, when you get to the elderly, women outlive men for the most part. That's true throughout the world, and that's why you see in that cohort, it's called a cohort, between 86 and 90, that there's twice as many older, senior women than there are men in Sweden. So that's considered a stable population. Now, a stable population is a bit of a challenge because how then do you deal with a demand for a younger workforce? And Sweden has had that problem. They are, after all, well, maybe deindustrializing economy, but consider, that Sweden's had an aircraft industry. It's had a huge automotive sector. Volvo is still huge. And so where do you get your workers? And that's why a lot of Western European countries have set up what they call guest worker programs, where they import labor from other countries. The first one to do this was Germany, and the workers came from Turkey. But today in Sweden, a lot of the workers might come from African countries, they might come from Middle Eastern countries. So that has sparked this resurgence of racism in Sweden, in Denmark, and running against immigration for politicians in Europe has been so successful that so many European countries now have in power either political parties or leaders that are very clear in terms of their disdain for immigrants. And that increases then the violence against immigrants, which Sweden has seen, unfortunately, a lot of. So that is why Wilders wins in Holland. It's a big surprise. It's why you have Orban in Hungary. It's why you have a right-wing government in Austria. Why Alliance for Germany, AF, Alliance for Deutschland in Germany is winning more and more seats in the parliament. Now, some are bucking the trend. Poland went the other way. Poland got rid of their right-wing government and put in something a lot more liberal. But Poles travel throughout Europe under EU rules and get jobs in other European countries. So that's one of the more footloose workforces in Europe is Polish workers. Before Brexit, a lot of the labor in Britain was from Poland. Declining, that would be both Japan and in this case, Singapore, it's a city-state. It's hard to call it a country, but you can see they're the same thing. Their population is shrinking. Their boom, the pig and the python, it's often been referred to, is that group between the ages of about 30 to about 50. And the world's largest countries, I wish they would present this graphically. I can't stand tables. That's why we have graphics. It's why we have pie charts and bars and so on. But it shows you populations in millions. And these are, it's actually quite a list. But with the big ones, China and India. And this is out of date. It says it's 2020. Sorry. Okay, I'm misreading. The columns on the left are 2020 and the ones on the right are 2050. So that's where you get the swap, where India becomes the most populous country in the world by 2050, projected at 1.6 billion. And China, if anything, will shrink a little bit on 1.4 billion to 1.43 billion. The US will grow quite a bit to 420 million, and we're at 331 right now. And you can see then the ones that grow, really quite significantly. interesting. I see that Nigeria. Oh, I see Nigeria got moved to from 206 million in 2020 to 300 million in 2050. This is better. It gives you much instant appreciation for which are the most populous countries in the world, and then arranged in little. This one is also another way of depicting largest populations in the world. And here they've organized them by continent, which is why you see the colors and why the big ones are not all in one place. But here what you can see is what is a total fertility rates for the whole world have fallen by more than half over the past 50 years. That's incredible. Much of this dramatic change has occurred in China and India. Progress has lagged in sub-Saharan Africa, but by 2050, the world average should be approaching a replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman on reproductive age by 2050. That is why a lot of these projections show us peaking at 2050 and not out of control by 2100. Now, it is true that sub-Saharan Africa still has the highest fertility rates in the world, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. Among them is the amount of dislocation in Africa is tremendous, given civil strife within countries, maybe even conflicts between countries, or not so much as there is in other parts of the world, like the Middle East. And you have persistent high fertility. A lot of the population in Africa is still rural. So that sometimes goes to some way of explaining, because rural families know that they benefit from having lots of kids. If you have a high infant mortality rate and you're going to lose some children to diseases, opportunistic diseases, then it behooves you to have more kids, because those kids are hands and they work. So the labor contributions of children in the rural sector of a lot of countries is a significant incentive for large families. It's probably most true in the island of Java and Indonesia, where a now deceased but wonderful anthropologist by the name of Clifford Geertz wrote a book called Agricultural Involution in Java. And what he showed is that if you have another kid, you're going to eat better, because it's a wet rice culture, and the more hands there are to transplant the rice paddy into the rice fields, the more hands that do that, the more rice grows. The more rice grows, the more you'll eat. So it does turn Malthus on his head, and it turns the neo-Malthusians on their head to undervalue the economic significance of children in the rural sector, in the farm sector. And this, by the way, is even true in the United States. If you go to family farms, I don't mean California corporate growers, I mean real family farms, like an Amish farm in Pennsylvania, you'll see that children work. Now, it might be their teenage children, but they work. And that is why right now we should be having a debate on child labor in the United States, because conservatives want to remove all of the obstacles to child labor. Why they want to do this, I don't know. Sometimes I think conservatives are just cynical, that they really don't care, because the data shows that a lot of undocumented teenagers are working in slaughterhouses in the United States. They're working on chicken farms. They're working in high-risk jobs in which there's actually a significant death rate. And the federal government has not done anything about this incredible abuse of human beings by private capital. I mean, slaughterhouses are, Smithfield. It isn't a mom and pop operation. It's one of the biggest corporations in the world, and they're either slaughtering pigs or slaughtering chickens or slaughtering cattle, and they hire lots and lots of undocumented teenagers. The construction industry, roofers, there's all these videos showing 14-year-olds putting roof tiles on houses. That's the construction sector, which is also highly concentrated, dominated by developers and the building trades and the crappy houses that they build, and they hire teenagers. So that's basically an illegal labor market. And there's very little being done about it, which is why it's coming up in major mainstream newspapers of like, look at this. Meanwhile, the Republicans of the Congress are saying, no. You can't, put labor laws, and limit child labor. It's astounding. We limited child labor in the 19th century. That's sometimes I think conservatives want to go back to the 19th century. That's their happy place. I don't know why. It was a horrible, horrible time. And if you look at family level child labor, it's a different story. That it's just essentially your own kids. So you're exploiting your own family. And peasants do this. Subsistence farmers do this throughout the world, where there is a point in which they're basically exploiting themselves in order to keep afloat in the marketplace or in order to meet their needs. So that is a really sad aspect of the reality of persistent high fertility in the rural sector, particularly on the African continent. Incidentally, a very important theorist, I think she actually worked for the World Bank, but she was in many ways a feminist, Esther Bosserup, and she's now deceased, but Esther Bosserup looked at the history of agriculture in China. And her thesis, which I think has stood the test of time, is that the reason why China had developed agricultural technologies way before anybody else did, meaning that they succeeded in intensification. Remember, I posited earlier that the history of agriculture is the history of intensification. How do you get more from the same amount of land? And Bosserup suggests that China could have never done that if they didn't have a burgeoning population, that it was their high numbers that allowed them to intensify their agricultural systems and to basically invent Chinese farming as we know it today, which is one of the most intensive and productive systems before the arrival of the Green Revolution and modern industrial farming. The Chinese farming sort of led the world in intensification. And this here is a trend. Where is the population going? Poor or less developed countries are expected to account for 90% of all population growth in this century. Here, once again, the book is driving me nuts. This has us reaching 10 billion by the year 2100. Their previous chart said we would be 11.2 billion by 2100. And then their other chart said we'd be 9 billion by 2100. So this is sloppy. This is sloppy on the part of Cunningham and Cunningham. Make up your minds. What is the projection? The only point they're making here, though, is that the less developed regions of the world will contribute the largest share of human population growth, whereas the developed countries will flatten out below 2 billion. So that much is true. This is also interesting because it says that the Earth's biocapacity is at approximately 13 billion gigahectares. And they have us reaching that somewhere in 1985. However, other charts I've seen show, well, overshoot day was 1970, when we exceeded the biocapacity of the planet in terms of consumption, where our consumption rates imply that we need another planet. This won't do. We've getting all we can out of it. So, but what's interesting here is the breakdown. How much of it is carbon storage, cropland, forest, grazing land, fishing grounds, and built-up land? Built-up land meaning the built environment, cities. And so this is the relative footprint of these different aspects in measured then in area. It's something that demographers and environmental scientists often do. They try to use some measure that allows you to mix apples and oranges, and that would be converting demand or consumption into hectares, into a unit of area, and then gigahectares is a lot of hectares. So looking at the terms to note, biocapacity is the capacity of living systems to provide our needs. Both biocapacity and global footprints can be measured in gigahectares. That's GHA. 1 hectare is 2.59 acres. 1 gigahectare is a billion hectares. The World Wildlife Fund calculated that an average hectare of land could store carbon equivalent to 1,450 liters of gasoline. We consume more than the Earth's biocapacity by mining ancient energy, soil, and other resources at a rate faster than these resources can be reproduced. Then I'm glad they used the word mining. A lot of our agricultural practices today are literally mining the soil. And what is our average footprint? Each person on the top consuming countries has a footprint of nearly 10 hectares. Half of the 171 countries evaluated by the World Wildlife Fund have a footprint of less than 2 hectares per person. If everyone had a typical American lifestyle, it would take 3.5 more Earth to support us all. That's an important takeaway. We should not be the measure and the end all and be all of what it is to have a sustainable society. And yet, when you look at our policies, United States policies throughout the world, it makes that exact assumption that every country should want to be like us. Well, even if that were true, that's not sustainable. It's already unsustainable with just us. In other words, our consumption is way over the top compared to the rest of the world. I find it interesting that population bombers, Malthusians, and neo-Malthusians are always concerned for the fertility rate of people in other societies, people of other races. That they're always obsessed with the fertility rate of India, of China. And they never look at their own consumption rate as problematic at all. They take it for granted that they have every right to consume as much as they want. I mean, I kid you not. Dick Cheney, remember him? Um, Famous line from Dick Cheney during the Bush and Cheney administration when the idea of signing an international agreement on the reduction of greenhouse gases. Dick Cheney, being the extreme right winger that he is, he only looks tame today because of Trump, said, our lifestyle is not up for negotiation. Our lifestyle is not up for negotiation. That's funny, Dick Cheney, because it ought to be. Why wouldn't it be? Why wouldn't we negotiate in such a way as to reduce our unfair claim on resources on the planet? The United States is less than 4% of the world's population, less than 4%. We consume about 65% of the world's trade in natural resources. We consume 25% of the world's crude petroleum. So no country in the world could possibly hope to copy that. It's uncopyable, not up for negotiation. Well, pardon me. This is carbon emissions are the largest part of our footprint. Burning fossil fuels, clearing of forests, and oxidation of agricultural soils emit climate-changing gases. These gases account for nearly all of our rising carbon footprint in the last 50 years. Wealthy countries vary greatly in the carbon emissions. Compare, for example, Sweden and the United States, which have similar wealth and standards of living. At nearly 10 hectares, our carbon footprint alone preempts a majority of the Earth's biocapacity. Our carbon footprint alone preempts a majority of the world's biocapacity. Interesting takeaway. Cropland. This is not unusual. American farms are like this. It's very different. You travel the world and you realize that we have a very decentralized farming system where farms are far apart. And where the farmstead, the farmhouse, the barn, the silo, the animals are, the next one is half a mile away. That isn't true of the way in which farmland used to be worked, for example, in Europe, where there's a village. It's actually quite dense with narrow little streets and charming little fountains. And that's where the peasants live. And then they go out to their fields. That has been part of European geography, rural geography, ever since the Middle Ages, because villages could be protected. You couldn't protect your atomized farm. Costs vary greatly. Some farming systems deplete soil and depend on fossil fuels. Others build soil and require few inputs. Grain-fed beef is perhaps our most costly agricultural product. Grain-fed beef. My late husband was from Missouri, and there's something about Midwestern people, they love their steaks. So we once went to Ruth Chris's steakhouse, and Scott had a bite of his filet mignon, and he said, ooh. So what's wrong with it? He said, it's corn-fed. Now, I have no idea how he could tell, but I guess if you really know your beef, he could tell the difference between a grass-fed cow and a corn-fed cow. And he didn't like corn-fed beef. So we do feed a lot of grain to cattle. And of course, we feed a lot to dairy cattle for dairy products. Built up land, how much land is occupied by roads and buildings? They take up less space than other uses, but preempt important ecological services. This is the problem of things being spread out. This is so American, so Canadian, where everything is spread out. Even our suburbs, the houses stand alone with lots of land around each one. I think it's terrible land use. I think suburbs are the worst social experiment on human beings ever undertaken. It has always come back to bite us, and it isn't done. We're going to pay the price for the suburbanization of people in the United States and Canada way into the future, because if anything is unsustainable, it's the suburbs. They don't even make sense. You have miles and miles and miles of cookie cutter houses. Each one looks exactly like the one next to it, and there's nothing else. There's no retail, there's no main street, there's no streetcar. There's just another cul-de-sac and another cul-de-sac and another silly little house with its kidney-shaped pool. And there's miles and miles, and they're all built by Pulte or by, what's his name, Broad, and they're built all at once. They built 700 houses in a period of 6 months. They're all horribly designed. They're made out of toothpicks and plywood and toxic substances like Tyvek and insulation. They build them for $135,000 and they sell them for $640,000. Suburbs, driveways, cars, freeways, parking lots, shopping centers, shopping malls. Oi, in my day, there was a band that was pretty popular. I think it was called Smashing Pumpkins. They had this song called 1979. I loved it. Back when MTV was MTV, you could watch a lot of music videos. And 1979 was this scathing critique of the suburbs. It showed you the alienation and boredom of youth, teenage youth in the suburbs. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to do, except maybe ride your skateboard. That's we've really are undercutting social fabric and cultural glue with the suburbs. We're atomizing people. We're putting them in their overpriced houses, and they're watching television all day long. It's probably mostly Fox News. They develop all kinds of paranoia against people that don't live in the same neighborhood or have a different race or have a different accent or come from a different country. And we have fomented that in the suburbs. The suburbs, let's not forget, came hand in hand with school integration, where white people did not want their kids to go to the same schools as people of color, as kids of different races. So they fled. It's called white flight. They fled the urban core and they moved to what was then the burgeoning suburbs that was brought to us by the automobile industry, cars, the petroleum industry. And so they were so happy. Now they could have their segregated schools, their safe little suburbs with their private cops, their paranoia, their Fox News. It's the worst thing that has ever happened to humanity is the suburbs. Okay, I exaggerate. Sometimes one has to exaggerate. It's what gets people's attention. If I were to say, well, suburbs aren't really that, not you would forget. Okay, here you have the problem of logging. Forestry provides our wood and paper products and many other useful products. Forests also protect watersheds, provide wildlife habitat, and purify and store water. So that here you see massive clear cutting. Grazing land. Can grazing deplete land? Expansive areas are needed for grazing. Overgrazing can degrade biodiversity and cause soil erosion. Less intense grazing can be an efficient way to convert grass to protein. There's a big debate about this, and we had one in our own LACCD because we invited two sustainable cattle people to our Earth Day event last April. And a lot of people pushed back and said, oh my God, you're defending cattle. But they had a very interesting point to make. Depending on where you grass feed cattle, they can be very good for soil, and they can actually be part of carbon capture. So it depends on the scale. It depends on the nature of the cattle rancher, him or herself. And by the way, the two we had were both women. Now one worked in a company, and so that a lot of our viewers didn't like the fact that we were promoting a product. We weren't, but she talked about her company. And then we had this one bloke explaining the science as to why you could, depending on where you graze your cattle, be actually contributing to sustainability. It's a legitimate debate because when you look at agro-pastoral people, those are the traditional indigenous people of the Sahelian belt of Africa and a lot of the African continent, and they have large herds of cattle. It was believed back then, and that when they had a drought in the 1970s, that their cattle were the cause of the denuding of the grasslands, of overgrazing, of desertification. That if the cattle were going to eat all the grass, then the desert would march. The Sahara would move south into the Sahel, all because of the agro-pastoral people's cattle herds. And what the best thing to do is to herd them into ranches and to create, modern industrial method of raising cattle, or to limit the size of their herds, which of course impoverishes them. The same bloke who came up with the theory that the cattle herds of Sahelian Africa were the cause of desertification gave a TED talk a few years ago where he finally did his mea culpa. He said, you know what? I was wrong. I was one of the main voices condemning these folks for their cattle, and I was wrong. Their cattle are good for the land. They replenish the soil the way that herds of wildebeest replaced hoofed animals on grasslands in Africa are good for the grasslands. So if they are having problems obtaining enough grassland, that is not a function of their economic system. It's a function of the country that they live in, where now there's fences where there weren't fences before. Now there's national boundaries where there weren't before. Now there's no reciprocation with subsistence farmers where that did exist before. So it's the interruption of a very resilient and sustainable system that leads to its decline. And then, of course, the experts and the expats come in and blame the victim. That is the real problem with so much stuff involving hunger, malnutrition, and population, is elite people turning around and blaming the victims for their situation. How much do we depend on in fishing grounds? Fishery impact is large for some countries. Globally, 90% of all large marine predators are gone. Take that one again. Globally, 90% of all large marine predators are gone, and 13 to 17 major fisheries are exhausted. We'll cover that in chapter 9. This is a Nassau grouper. That is why this little chart here shows you what are called the low impact countries that are all below that magic line that we looked at earlier that was called the global average of 2.7 hectares per person per year as the boundary, the top boundary. They also have divided the sectors appropriately into carbon storage, cropland, forest, grazing land, fishing grounds, and built-up land. But these are small impact countries. A lot of them are literally small, but look at Brazil. Very populous country, very big, and it's between Mauritius and Malaysia. So we cannot tell these countries that they should develop economic systems that look like the United States. And in fact, that's exactly what we're doing. We do it through the International Monetary Fund. We do it through the World Bank. We do it for the Inter-American Development Bank. We do it through commercial bank investments, the privatization of banks in Latin America. All of these are ways in which the American capitalist system imposes on other countries our version of capitalism. And that is obviously not a good idea. This is one of those posters extolling the virtue of having a girl in China. So this is the one-child policy was remarkably successful in reducing birth rates, but social costs were also high. And that's what I referred to earlier as this real skewing of gender in China between males and females. Life expectancy at birth. Okay, this is another important demographic statistic. And it's really referring to, do you have a longevity? Well, this is of countries in 1900 and 2020. So in 1900, India, Russia, US, Sweden, and Japan all had life expectancies that were, by any measure today, really low. The longest living people in 1900 were Swedes, that women lived to the age of 60. Hold on to your seat. And then the rest are below that. Then you look at the year 2020 for those same countries, India, Russia, the US, Sweden, and Japan. And the US, Sweden, and Japan have a life expectancy at birth of higher than 80. They live to be 82, 85, and 88. Japan has one of those areas in the world where there's a lot of longevity. People live very long lives. A lot of people attribute it to their diet, that the Japanese diet doesn't have all of the hyper-processed stuff and all the starchy stuff and all the sugars that we like in our Western diet. And as a result, in terms of chronic illness, they show maybe a different host of chronic illnesses, but it also explains their longevity. In here, what you're seeing is an annual per capita gross national product on the x-axis, measured in thousands of dollars, and life expectancy years on the y-axis. So it shows you which are those countries with, well, let's see, as incomes rise, so does life expectancy, up to about $5,000 US. Above that amount, the curve levels off. Some countries, such as South Africa and Russia, have far lower life expectancies than their GDP would suggest. Jordan, on the other hand, which is only 1/10 of the per capita GDP of the United States, is actually at a higher life expectancy. There, once again, what we're seeing in the US is that our life expectancy is now in decline. It's quite alarming, where, and particularly for non-white people, but actually it's affected a lot of the white working class as well, where people are not living as long as, maybe their parents. And that is, I think a lot of it is a factor of what we've done to our food system, that we basically have an almost toxic food system. And I think it's responsible for the chronic illnesses that are cutting people's lives short. But you can see here that ones that are off the chart, Qatar, Bermuda, and Luxembourg. But the real biggie there are, if you go from, it's interesting that Russia and Hungary have a high per capita income, but are in fact of low life expectancy. So these are the different ways in which agriculture works in the world. On this side, you have what could be a very traditional system of farming. If you were in Vietnam, that is, these water buffalo are the traction animal, the farm animal par excellence. Rural areas with little mechanized agriculture, children are needed to tend livestock. That is a kid. Care for younger children and help parents with household chores. So once again, the economic significance of children often does determine family size. Where agriculture is mechanized, rural families have few children, just as urban families do, helpful but not critical to survival. This affects the decision about how many children to have. Yes, it does. This definitely affects that. But let's consider what we will talk about also in the chapter on agriculture and food. What are the factors of production in agriculture? This is something that Karl Marx helped us get our brain around. For Marx, there were three. There's land, labor, and capital. When you look at the farm sector of any country, they're not equal in terms of their determining influence. For example, the United States, traditionally, meaning modern United States, has had a lot of land and a lot of capital and not a lot of labor. In fact, if we want to go back into looking at the political economy of the slave states in Southeast United States, that was a direct result of the fact that they couldn't bring in enough immigrants to work in plantation agriculture, which is labor intensive. In terms of area, it is extensive. And for that reason, the Southern economy depended entirely on chattel labor, that is, on the enslavement of people. And so it was different than the farming in the Midwest, which was, in a sense, settler farming. But that fact that the United States is rich in land and capital and poor in labor when it comes to the farm sector is why we were the first country in the world to mechanize farming. The machines came in to take the place of labor. And that isn't true of other countries which have very different factors of production. Most developing countries, for example, have a lot of labor, not a lot of land, and hardly any capital. It's almost an inverse version of the United States. Yet, what do we export to countries like Brazil and other countries in the world in terms of a farm system? We export our system. We don't make the best of their system. We export our system. And the critical part there is farm machines, the mechanization of agriculture. Do you really need to mechanize agriculture in countries where your biggest asset is labor, like it is in Africa? It's what the richest thing is your people. So instead, you're going to go into debt to buy Massey Ferguson tractors to take the place of the farmers. It begs the question, isn't there another way? Isn't there a better way of organizing the farm sector that takes advantage of what are the comparative advantages? Let's go back to Adam Smith. What are the comparative advantages of developing countries in the rural sector? Lots of labor, not a lot of land, and hardly any capital. This shows you the total fertility as girls' education increases and infant mortality decreases. This is what I brought up earlier on the determining variable. Now, there's an interesting thing, remember that causation and correlation is not causation, but this is a compelling correlation to the extent that girls enter high school. And I think when they talk about education, they really talk about secondary school, because that does seem to be the determining variable. The higher the percentage of girls in high school, the lower the fertility rate. Education matters. It allows women to make independent decisions, even when they live in very patriarchal societies where the pressure from their in-laws to have another son or to have their first son is tremendous. It's tremendous in India. And it goes against what women with some education would rather have. Today, if you look at, in the United States, women will delay their firstborn until they've gotten their college degree or even started a career. That choice is growing throughout the world, where young women do not want to have their first baby when they're 17 or 19. They want to get an education. They want to be able to have something to do economically to take care of themselves and maybe even their kids. And so they delay the firstborn. It's not unusual in the United States for young women to want their first child to be born when they're 28, when they're 27 and not 17. That has a huge impact on population growth, the delaying of the firstborn. These are all the concepts in demography that I submit to you are far more interesting, far more scientific, far more quantitative than Thomas Malthus's obsession with the passion of the sexes or Garrett Hardin's obsession with drowning poor people. Infant mortality rate also drops. Once again, because having some degree of education might help in terms of income. So these are correlations. They aren't that proximate to the decision making. These are distant causes of fertility increase or fertility decrease. And it is important to note that infant mortality is particularly a factor of lack of income more than any other variable. So here you can see the 1910 to the year 2010, so it's a good 100 years, and it is depicting something called the demographic transition. It's the pivot point of the chapter. It's the most important takeaway that we should now use this in order to disabuse ourselves of the Malthusian idea that there's too many people and not enough blank. Incidentally, Paul Ehrlich, who I was defending a minute ago, created an organization called ZPG, Zero Population Growth. To him, that was going to be the solution to everything. Remember that Malthusians and neo-Malthusians lay everything, the blame for everything on human population growth. They don't seem to understand exploitation or just too many people. So I was scheduled to actually debate ZPG at UC Berkeley because by then I had a popularity in the geography department as, Leddy is really anti-Malthusian. If you want to, stick it to the population bombers, the rabbit theorists, go get Leddy. He'll go nuts on them. It's true. I did. And so when I went into this debate, there was a poster that they had pinned up on the bulletin board in the entrance to the auditorium. And the poster came from ZPG. And in the middle of the poster was a rectangle that had the word overpopulation. And coming out of that rectangle was everything: crime, hunger, malnutrition, war, pestilence, disease, famine, violence, murder, every possible human ill was connected like a spider, like the legs of a gigantic spider, to one thing: overpopulation. Well, I'm glad they put that, because then when I went into the debate, I said, well, see, if you guys are right, let's just shut down the university. I mean, why should we study any problem if we already know the cause? If the cause is too many people, why aren't you out there screaming and yelling to close sociology, political science, economics, for that matter, philosophy? Let's close all these. They cost too much, and we're teaching people all wrong. We need to teach them one thing: limit your numbers, limit your population. So I don't like ZPG and I don't like neo-Malthusians. They are so disingenuous in their argumentation. And I submit to you, there's only one reason why neo-Malthusian ideas have not gone away. The reason is entirely ideological. It has nothing to do with empirical reality. Entirely ideological, meaning that people who invoke these ideas sleep at night because they now have an explanation for things that if they tried another explanation, it would make them uncomfortable. If your explanation for poverty is numbers of people and not exploitation, well, then it's not your fault. So that is the magic of this ideology, is that it takes the richest people off the hook. It displaces the cause of a problem to the cause that isn't, and it lets people who believe in inordinate wealth to sleep at night. What you see here is the demographic transition. And then they've actually, in this case, because it's covering 100 years, we might think this is the demographic transition in, say, the United States. And in fact, demographic transition was criticized originally as being based entirely on the experience of Western Europe and rich countries that had gone through this period. However, today, the demographic transition can be seen taking place in all of the planet. Even countries that are still fundamentally rural or agrarian are going through a demographic transition. What you can see in this case is that you have, well, I'm going to go for their definition down here. Birth rates in the United States, 1910 to 2010. The falling birth rate from 1910 to 1929 represents a demographic transition from an agricultural to an industrial society. The baby boom followed World War II, lasted from 1945 to 1965. A much smaller echo boom occurred around 1980 when the baby boomers started to reproduce. So this is actually tracing not population growth rates, but it's using the term birth rates. This is more what you might see as a classic demographic transition. A theoretical, let me make it bigger. Come on. Thank you. Notice that here the total population is going from in the pre-modern stage to the post-industrial stage. The total population grows, but what's happening underneath that? In the pre-modern stage, that is agrarian societies, you have a high death rate and a high birth rate. So the population is stable, let's put that in quotes, because the cost of that stability is very high. In other words, there's a lot of births and a lot of deaths. Then the industrialization happens, where the death rate plummets because you have modern medicine, you have people are eating better. So the crude death rate drops in that stage two, the urbanizing, industrializing stage. But the birth rate remains high for all kinds of reasons we've talked about: demographic lag, cultural lag. And it's that gap between the red line here, the crude death rate, and the blue line here, the birth rate. This gap is called the population explosion. This is when population increases the most. So you could follow the population growth curve here. You can see it really takes off when you have this gap. And it continues to grow and grow, even in a mature industrial society. But when the crude birth rate gets to the level of the crude death rate, so now you also have stable population, but at a very low cost, meaning people aren't dying like flies and they aren't being born like rabbits. And so you have then the population leveled off. This is called the post-industrial stage. Okay, where are we today in the world? Well, that's interesting. Most of the planet today is right here. Most of the world today. I would have never thought that 40 years ago, that this would happen that quickly, but it has, and it's wonderful. It means that the demographic transition is succeeding in leveling off human population growth all across the board, with the obvious exception of sub-Saharan Africa for reasons we've already, in some ways touched upon. But this is a very significant thing because India is here, China is here, Brazil is here, the United States is over here, Western Europe is over here. So we're not going to see a huge jump in human population anymore. We're going to see it slowly level off. So the real question is, how slowly? Will it happen in the next 40 years or will it happen in the next 80 years? I think it'll happen in the next 40 years. And what you see here are the demographic transition can be seen in many families. The author's grandparents with 17 siblings between them had better survival than their forebears, more opportunities, and few children, including the author's mother. I used to ask students in my class when we had in-person classes about their family size. And so the first question was, how many children was your grandmother or grandfather? How big was their family? And then your parents, and then yourself or your siblings. For example, in my family, my grandmother was from Arequipa, Peru, and from a very well-to-do family, by the way. They had a very nice house. And they owned borax mines in the Andes. She was one of 15 children. It's amazing. And they were a rich family. The way they raised 15 kids is they had shifts. 5 kids are sleeping, 5 kids are eating, 5 kids are playing. Blow the whistle, next shift. How do you take care of 15 kids? Now, also at the time, high infant mortality rate. Arequipa, Peru wasn't exactly, the quintessence of industrial society. So yes, you had a lot of opportunistic illnesses that would reduce that size of that family. My grandmother went on to have 9 kids. Actually, I think she had 8, and 1 was from marriage. My mother had 6 kids. My sister has 2 kids. 3. Lisa Angelica. It was her birthday yesterday. How could I forget? And my brother in North Carolina has 1 kid. That is, think of your own families, your own family history, and you can see that same reduction in family size from your grandparents' generation to your generation. And that is happening globally, the shrinking of family size. Population growth resulting from high birth rates has important impacts on resource consumption. But small, wealthy families consume far more resources per person, usually sourced from around the globe. Many people debate which impact is more important, but ultimately there are good reasons for reducing both family size and consumption rates. Interesting. They would make that point because um, a baby born in Dallas, Texas, a Anglo kid born in Dallas, Texas today will consume as much resources in its lifetime as a whole village in India. So I don't know why they think that this is obviously we think it's okay because it's us. It's this is what we all want to have swimming pool and this happy couple has two kids. They've replaced themselves, but their standard of living, their consumption rate is way over the top. This is a larger family, but their consumption rate is relatively low. And yet this family that you're seeing here in India isn't rich, but they aren't poor either. Maybe the kids are walking barefoot. That's not unusual in India, but everybody has nice modern clothing and a lot of smiles in their faces. If we were in India, we would say that they're actually middle class and not at the bottom of the social scale. So here are the projections, very compelling for what will happen in our near future. So beginning with, let's see, they're making these estimates beginning in 1945, it looks like, or 1950. So this is the total population on planet Earth. Population projections for different growth scenarios. Recent progress in family planning and economic development have led to significantly reduced estimates compared to a few years ago. That was the point I just made. I would have never thought this 40 years ago. The median projection is 8.9 billion in 2050. So once again, this book is driving me nuts. This is the fourth projection they've made. This one I think is the closest to reality. 8.9 billion in 2050, it'll peak, compared to previous estimates over 10 billion for that date. So they've been inconsistent in terms of their sourcing of data here, where they're giving us different scenarios. So you have everything stays the same scenario. That's the dotted line at the top that has us at, over 13 billion by the end of the century. You have the most likely trend, which is the one in the middle that has us at 11.2 billion by 2100, which flies in the face of the caption for the very same diagram here. And then you have the one that shows us peaking in 2050, actually in 2080 at 9.6 billion. I think that this one is actually now the most likely. This might indicate a Japan problem. That is an aging of human population in ways that really baffle the possibilities of maintained high fertility. But it's very interesting that that this is now far more believable than it was a few years ago. A few years ago, we were all quite committed to the middle one. But now the United Nations is saying that we might actually see, well, remember what it showed in the article I showed you, that we would drop to 4 billion people by the end of the century. That's all the way down here, 4 billion. The other projections say that we will drop to 6 billion by 2100. So that would be the Japan scenarios for the entire planet. And the current scenario is at 9.5 by 2100. I also think this is unrealistically high given the trends. Oops. Oh, don't tell me to buy my New York Times, you silly rabbits. Oof. Oh, oh God, yes. Bubba. Oh, oh, Bubba. Oh, blimey. There you go. Oh, so, world's population may peak in your lifetime. What happens next? The reason I have to share this as a web page is that the graphics are very New York Times. The global population has been climbing for the past 2 centuries. What's normal for us alive today, growing up while the world's growing rapidly, may be a blip in human history. Children born today will very likely live to see the end of global population growth. Let me repeat that one. Children born today will very likely live to see the end. Can you see this? Screen sharing has paused. Oh, damn. Wait a minute. You can't see this. Oh, crap. Stop the share. Okay, this is the one I'm sharing. It's New York Times. It's recent, and that's why I'm sharing it. You can see then the climb, which is from 110 million people in 1000 BC to 8 billion people in 2022. Actually, 2024. That is not accurate. The baby born this year will be 60 in 2080 when demographers at the UN expect the size of humanity to peak. The Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital in Vienna places the peak in 2070s. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, University of Washington, puts it in 2060. All predictions agree on one thing: we will peak soon. And then we shrink. Humanity will not reach a plateau and stabilize. It will begin unprecedented decline, the Japan scenario. That's why saying 4 billion by the end of the century is not a crazy idea, because most demographers look ahead at only 2100. There's no consensus on exactly how many populations will fall after that. So over the past 100 years, the human population has quadrupled from 2 billion to 8 billion. As long as life continues as it has, with people choosing smaller family size, now common, then 22nd or 23rd century, our decline could just be as steep as our rise. Very important, because you do get decline when people stop having kids. So it's a very interesting article. I think, I don't know if I was not able to put a link to it in the module for today because it has the paywall. It has the New York Times paywall, and I'm a subscriber, so I'm sharing it now. But these are the projections you can see for different countries, where the size of the circle indicates 1 billion or 100 million or 100,000. So the Niger, Mali, Nigeria, these are countries with high birth rates. And then going to replacement fertility, and then you can see all the ones that are the gray dots above here are above replacement. So they have a TFR, a total fertility rate, of above 2.1 or 2.0. But then you get to where India has now reached replacement, interestingly, because it's done it entirely voluntarily, unlike China. But it is also, so the projection for India is it'll reach 2 billion people by 2080, was it the peak year they were saying? Now, personally, I think this is all really good news. I don't know why it is that some of my colleagues like never can quite figure out, because even one of my Malthusian colleagues, who just can't let Thomas Malthus go, doesn't think this is good at all. You know, he was condemning China for their successful replacement rate. Now, it's true that the social cost in China to achieve that has been relatively high compared to Thailand, compared to other countries, even India. However, China also was undergoing a radical transformation of their society and economy. So you had a very high death rate due to famine and dislocation. So I like these graphics that kind of move and do things. And so that is that one. And now, yes, I think I have time to share one thing with you in the Finder. There's this one, which was, okay, come on. Oh, Apple. Oh, God. Apple's going downhill so fast, I can feel the breeze in my ears. This is the last image in the chapter 418, fertility rates by country. The average fertility in the United States is currently 2.06, below the replacement rate of 2.1. And why the thing is the wrong size, only Apple knows. Okay, is that it? Why does it look so damn blurry? I hate doing it twice. So this is the world map that really, I mean, it's worth seeing because it shows you the contrast between most of the world and the African continent, sub-Saharan Africa. Incidentally, Latin America used to have a total fertility rate that was really high. It was like 7. When I was a kid growing up in Mexico, half of the population was under the age of 15. Yep. When I was a teenager, when I was 12 years old in Mexico, half of the population in Mexico was under the age of 15, which does indicate that there's going to be a huge boom. Remember, demographic lag. When that cohort begins to reproduce, even at replacement rate, you're going to see a doubling of the population, which indeed we did see. But look at Latin America today, including Brazil, Uruguay, all the Americas, with the exception of some Central American countries, have reached close to replacement rate. Nobody in a million years could have imagined that. And yet it happened. It happened. And that's in countries where the Catholic Church still has a major influence on, for example, birth control policy, availability of contraception or of the pill. The church is opposed to that. What is interesting is that even in very Catholic countries like Peru, you go into shanty towns in Lima, and women very comfortably exercise birth control. They want 2 kids and no more. So people are able to separate religious dogma, which is cultural lag, from immediate expediency, which is practicality. And they are ultimately practical. Do I want 5 kids that I can't educate or feed, or I want 2 kids that I can take to the hospital if they're sick and I can educate them? And because people in cities are finding that despite the fact that cities can be really horrible and dirty and smoggy and crowded, they still rather live there than in the tiny little village in the Andes where the nearest doctor was 10 miles away, where your baby got sick. Sorry, your baby died. Where the only food you have is what you harvested from your potato field. You go to Lima, and there's food everywhere, and there's jobs everywhere, there's cash everywhere, there's schools, there's hospitals. So no wonder you have this sort of decanting of the countryside. It's major migration from rural to urban that is global. It's happening in all the countries of the world, but it's particularly marked in Latin America, where most people in Latin America live in cities today. And where you actually, in terms of the Andes, you have, and in Mexico as well, you've seen a real decanting of the rural sector. You go to villages where the only people left are old people. This happens in many states in Mexico where all the young people have migrated either to cities in Mexico or to the United States looking for work. So it does look at the African continent, you can see that their fertility rates are still quite high compared to the rest of the world. And that has a lot to do with, I think, the fact that the global economy continuously neglects reality in Africa. We continually exploit political conditions within African countries to our own immediate interest, which is sometimes global. It has nothing to do with, doesn't have to do with Kenya. But yet we're very concerned because it's that troubled area of the world, and ISIS is in Somalia. And so we constantly harness our policy toward African countries to criteria that's outside of those countries, to our Middle Eastern policy or our anti-terrorist policy or our global trade policy. And so I think that's true of Western Europe in particular, because so many African countries still have what we might call neo-colonial bonds to the so-called mother country, the original colonial power, which typically is France, Britain, and Portugal. So that creates an economic dependence that is very real, and that's why countries like Mali are going through a convulsion right now. They're trying to kick out the French because they've become really fatigued with this legacy of colonialism. And there's no place on earth where the legacy of colonialism is deeper than in the African continent. Even the boundaries of the countries were carved by European powers in Berlin in the 19th century. They got a map out and said, okay, Germany gets this, France gets this, Britain gets this. And that's how we got the modern African countries of today, with the very important exception of Ethiopia, which was never successfully colonized by European powers. They tried, they did not succeed. So Ethiopia stands out. Ethiopia has always been Ethiopia. But the other countries are multinational, multi-ethnic, multilingual. People in Kenya come from as many as 6 different ethnic groups. They speak as many as 6 different languages. So it's very difficult for countries like that to quote unquote modernize. That said, Kenya is doing quite well. But you can see that global policy toward the African continent has a lot to do with conditions within African countries, where the former European colonial powers are still exerting excessive influence on events and political change within those countries. So I submit to you that that goes to some way of explaining persistent high fertility in the rural sector in the African continent. Okay, let me do a stop the share there. And then, come on, thingy, go away. No, thank you. There is time. There is time for you to watch this very important um, clip, very important video. It lasts, what does it say? It lasts, no, it doesn't tell me. Crikey. Okay, we'll put a pause on it. Let's make it bigger. Make it bigger. What are we in? We're in QuickTime. Okay. So late. Okay, QuickTime.
This is a story about Ireland, and it's a story about an event that you've probably heard of, but might not know much about. It's usually called the Irish Potato Famine. In most history books, the Irish potato famine doesn't get a lot of attention. At most, it appears as a pretty simple story to explain Irish migration abroad. In the beginning, Irish people depended on the potato for food. Then there was a potato disease. Many Irish died, and others migrated abroad on what they called coffin ships to England, Scotland, Australia, and North America. But the story of the famine is a lot more complicated and a lot more disturbing than that. It was much less natural and much more artificial than you might think. And it all goes back to a man named Thomas Malthus. Malthus was a British economist. And in 1798, Malthus put forward an influential idea and a rather counterintuitive one. Malthus said that when food production increased, people were better off for a little. But that improvement led to an increase in population, which eventually caused societal problems. There were too many people and not enough food to go around. Poverty and famine were the natural results. Like animals, Malthus said, humans had a certain carrying capacity. When it exceeded that carrying capacity, enough people would die to return the population to a natural equilibrium. So in the 19th century, that so-called Malthusian model became the conventional wisdom in European intellectuals. It led them to focus on what they called overpopulation and made them think of famine as nature reducing population to a sustainable level. No serious economist today will tell you that having too many people is the reason people are poor or hungry. In 1981, the economist Amartya Sen explained the real cause of most historical famines. If you look at the historical record, Sen said, a collective lack of food is never the real problem. The cause of famines, while it often has something to do with a decline in agricultural production, is more related to the unequal distribution of food. There's enough food for everyone, but some people can't exchange what they have for that food. Sen found that famine is usually not the result of too little food, but of exploitation and unequal economic relations. Irish people were the other against whom the British could define themselves. They were viewed as lazy, barbaric, barely human. Ireland itself was run as a colony for the emerging class of British capitalists. While England was rapidly becoming the wealthiest country in the world, Ireland was kept incredibly poor. The population was almost entirely composed of peasants. The large majority of all houses were huts made of mud. And the land those peasants lived on was owned almost entirely by absentee English landlords who never visited Ireland and extracted exorbitant amounts in rent. Even the British government regarded these landlords with disdain, calling them, quote, the most oppressive species of tyrant that has ever lent assistance to the destruction of a country. So most Irish people were on a treadmill of extreme poverty. They were the most destitute people in all of Europe. In many districts, one government report found, their only food is the potato, their only beverage, water, a bed or a blanket is a rare luxury. And that part about the potato is especially important. Ireland has a lot of fertile soil and a topography that is ideal for grazing cattle. But when the British came in and colonized Ireland, They systematically took that land and used it to produce beef for the domestic English market. And so the economically poor Irish turned to the potato, a versatile crop that could be grown in large numbers on bad soil. And while the potato was adaptable, it was also really unreliable. There had been widespread potato failures pretty much every other year in the 19th century. And in the 1840s, a new potato disease, originally from North America, arrived in Europe. Huge potato crop failures sprung up in northern France, in Belgium, and in the Netherlands. But none of those places were as dependent on the potato as a source of food as was Ireland. So when the disease got to Ireland in the 1840s, the results were devastating. In 1845, about a third of the Irish crop was destroyed. By 1846, 75% of it was gone. Hunger spread rapidly with unprecedented severity. This period became known in Ireland as An Drachil, the bad life. But as Amartya Sen observed, this wasn't just about a pure lack of food. In fact, during the entire period of the famine, Ireland was continuing to export food out of the country. Enough cows, sheep, pigs, and grain were being shipped out of Ireland that could feed the Irish population twice over. But the British government refused to do anything about it. Soon, the Irish began begging their British overlords for relief. And early on, the Conservative Party government, then the representatives of the old British aristocracy, had a fairly sympathetic response. They bought food from America and brought it to Ireland, distributing it to the poor. But in 1846, a different party, the Whigs, came to power in Britain. And the Whigs did not have the sort of aristocratic paternalism that the Conservatives had. They were advocates of a philosophy called laissez-faire, the idea that the free market, left alone, would solve virtually any problem. So the person they put in charge of famine relief in Ireland was a man named Charles Trevelyan. Trevelyan had been a colonial administrator in India, and he was a big believer in those Malthusian ideas about population. He didn't really want to stop the starvation. He thought it was, well, necessary. The famine, Trevelyan said, was, quote, an effective mechanism for reducing surplus population. He said, it was the judgment of God that sent the famine to teach the Irish a lesson. The real evil, he said, is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the Irish people. So Trevelyan's solution to the famine was to let it ride. The laissez-faire Whigs decided to change nothing. They refused to stop the movement of food to England and limited the amount of food they offered to the starving Irish people. The food that was being imported into Ireland was largely used not to feed the Irish, but to feed the cattle being slaughtered for British consumption. Even when they did offer some relief to the Irish peasants, they instituted moralistic tests, requiring that recipients live as indentured servants in a workhouse to improve their work ethic. The British even required that food only go to people who owned almost no land, forcing impoverished farmers to sell all the remaining land they had to their landlords, many of whom lived in Britain. And so the famine only got worse. Diseases of hunger like typhus, dysentery, and cholera spread wildly, killing just as many people as the lack of food. Social structures broke down. Ordinary people turned en masse to begging, crime, prostitution. In Western Ireland, some resorted to cannibalism. The British, fearing a rebellion, sent army troops instead of food. As the news of the famine spread all over the world, shiploads of food finally began arriving. Americans from all strata generously sent money and food over the Atlantic, only to have their donations met with huge British cargo fees upon arrival. Even the Choctaw people donated to the famine relief funds, just a few years after they had experienced starvation themselves on the Trail of Tears. It was a beautiful example of international solidarity. But these donations weren't enough to stop the ruthless exploitation by British landlords. Even when enough food was being imported, it wasn't getting to the Irish people. Starvation and death continued. Impoverished Irish, with barely enough to eat, were evicted from their homes. One priest remembers the scene of a mass eviction. 700 human beings were driven from their homes in one day and sent adrift on the world to gratify the caprice of one who before God and man probably deserved less consideration than the last and the least of them. The hard scenes I had then witnessed, I must remember all my life long. The wailing of women, screams, the terror, consternation of children, the speechless agony of honest, industrious men, wrung tears of grief from all who saw them. By the time the famine began to end in the early 1850s, about 20% of the Irish population, 2 million human beings, had died of disease or hunger. Another 2 million had left for brighter shores. Today, Ireland's population is still lower than it was in the 1840s. But Ireland has never forgotten the famine and the generosity that some showed to them. During COVID, when the people of the Navajo Nation were hit hard, Ireland repaid their kindness shown to them during the famine by raising $2 million. And Ireland has never forgotten those who did not help them, the British government, and all those who valued profits over humanity. As the British historian A.J.P. Taylor would later write, the English governing class had the blood of 2 million Irish people on their hands. All Ireland was a Belsen. I'm Rory Duffy, professor of history and filmmaker for the Gravel Institute.
So there you have it in a nutshell, the Irish potato famine. In New York City, along what is now the redone Hudson River Park, there's a monument to the Irish potato famine. I was quite amazed that, and it has all these quotes that you saw in today's clip. We've gone a little bit over. I'm going to stop the recording and